Good morning. Well, I've been thinking a lot about my brother this week. My brother is a police officer in Montgomery County Police, and it's been a week of news media involving police, a lot of police in different ways, pluses, minuses. So I've been thinking a lot about my brother this week, and for a couple reasons. One, because he's a police officer, and two, because he's my brother, and we're going to talk about two brothers this morning. And so I'm going to share a little bit about that. But I've also been thinking about him and how he has to deal with the public. And one of the things that I also found recently discovered about my brother that he wasn't telling any of us was that he just got an award for saving somebody's life. And I share that because I know the media will never cover that. I know the media, and there's perspective there, and I think about all the lives that my brother has actually helped or saved versus the lives that have been taken. And I think we need to keep everything in perspective as we think about what's happened this week. And it's interesting that we're talking about Cain and Abel this morning, about hate, anger, and how that led to someone's murder. And so we have to think about how we're dealing with sin and anger in our own lives and how we're responding to it. And so we're going to talk about that this morning. But I also wanted to say something nice about my brother because I'm going to throw him under the bus right now. So one day, I think we were both in our 20s. We're at the dinner table with my parents and our spouses, and so we're a little bit older at this point in our lives. He's a police officer, I'm a pastor, and I was at the dinner table talking about how I got a speeding ticket. That's right, the pastor got a speeding ticket. Heaven forbid. And they don't let pastors off. They let cops off, by the way. If you get a speeding ticket, my brother gets pulled over, he gets off. They're like, no, you get it anyway. So I get the speeding ticket, and I'm sitting here talking about how I got pulled over for speeding at the dinner table, and my mom makes a comment. She says, well, your brother's always been a better driver than you. So there's this part of me that just reacts to that, right? What do you mean he's a better driver than me? And how come he's getting my mom's favor in this department and I'm not? What did I ever do? I got a speeding ticket. I was about to say one, but I've got more than one. I got a speeding ticket, right? And what, just because he's a police officer? So I look at my brother who's sitting across the table. He's smiling. Yeah, that's right. And I say to him, I look over him, I say, can I tell her? He's like, tell her what? Kind of like, oh, Mr. Innocent over there. I'm like, oh, can I tell her about what happened when you first got your driver's license? He just smiled and was like, oh, let's not remember that, all that stuff. So I said, Mom, did you know that your son, the great driver, the first day he got his driver's license, he got a speeding ticket on the very first day of his driver's license. She never knew about that. I knew about that. She never knew about it because he was driving his friend's Mustang, a red Mustang convertible, and he was speeding, got pulled over on his first day of his driver's license. I said, you didn't know about that, did you, Mom? She's like, no, I never knew about that. And I said, do you remember the time that he made that illegal left turn into traffic and got in the accident? Do you remember that accident? Oh, yeah, that's right, he had that accident. And so I begin to list all the errors. And she goes, okay, well, maybe you're both good drivers. So that's what, So I think about that, but the question is what led to that response, right? Sibling rivalry, right? Wait, Mom's giving him more favor than me, so I've got to correct the situation. And isn't that what we see going on with Cain and Abel? God's giving Abel more favor. Abel's offering is better than Cain's offering. What is that about? And a lot of times we question, what was it about Abel's offering that made Abel's offering better than Cain's offering? And there are two qualities actually mentioned in the text. That one, it says that Abel's offering, he gave of the firstlings or the firstborn of his flocks. That means he gave the best sheep. He didn't give the runts of the litter. He gave his very best. And then it says that he gave the fat portions. That's like saying that he gave God the best, choicest cuts of meat, the highest grade A, right? And so the quality of his offering was that he gave his best to God in his offering, which was also reveals his faith. Because when we have faith in God, we're more likely to give our best. When we have faith that God will continue to provide for us more sheep, more quality, then we will give God our best, knowing that God will provide for us. But Cain doesn't seem to give his best. And so it seems to us that here Abel's giving his best to God and Cain is not. Now some people say, well, that doesn't seem fair to Cain. And I think about that and I think, well, if Abel does A work and gets an A, and Cain does C work, do we expect him to get an A when he offers a C average, right? Wasn't it? And here's the thing: there wasn't anything wrong with Cain's offering. It just wasn't, the quality of it wasn't A, And so naturally, Abel gets this favor he gets an A from God, basically. And Cain is but Cain's kind of on the inside going, that's not fair. Maybe the same way I was at the dinner table going, that's not fair for you to think that, and I corrected that, right? But maybe that's it. But how often do we say that, right, as siblings? How many people here have brothers and sisters, right? And how many times have you said, how many times? You probably can't even count, right? How many times have you said to your parents, that's not fair? A lot, right? Right? Because, they got a bigger piece of cake than me. That's not fair. They got soda and I didn't. That's not fair. They got more money and I didn't. That's not fair. Maybe we're confusing something. Maybe we're confusing fairness with jealousy. Maybe we're really just jealous that they're getting favor or jealous that they're getting something that we're not getting. And oftentimes, at you as parents, when your kids come to you and say, that's not fair, what is your immediate response to that when you get accused of not being fair? Life's not fair, right? Or I list all the things that I have done for the other kid, right? Well, what about the time I did this for you? And what about the time I did this for you? And what about the time? Oh, yeah, Dad, I forgot about those things, right? Because really it's sometimes more about jealousy than it is about fairness. Maybe we get the two confused. Maybe somebody gets something that we are not getting at the same moment, and we claim it's not fair when really we're just jealous. And so maybe that's what Cain is really wrestling with is jealousy and not fairness. But it's interesting that God, in God's wisdom and God's kindness and God's grace, comes to Cain. Recognizing, when, if you're a parent, when something's up with one of your kids, right? When there's something not right. You can tell when they're not really being themselves, and you can tell something's wrong. And so it's interesting that God goes directly to Cain and has a discussion with Cain and says, Cain, what's going on? Why are you feeling this way? And he says, and then he offers to Cain some advice, and he offers to Cain some understanding about what's going on. He says, Cain, look, I see that your countenance has fallen. I see that you're dejected by this, but if you do well, if you do grade A work, I'll give you an A too. You'll be lifted up. You will be recognized. You will be favored. You will be accepted. You will be forgiven. If you do what your brother does, you too will get the same response. You'll be lifted up. But if you don't, if you decide not to go down that road, if you decide not to do what your brother has done, if you decide to go a different route, know this. The text we read says sin is lurking at the door. Actually, in the Hebrew, it's more like crouching. It's and it's calling into mind that guards guarding a citadel, the door of a citadel, they would crouch in defense, getting ready to pounce on anything that would enter in through that door. Anything that came through that door, the guards were crouching, ready to attack whatever came in or to come through. So the image that the text is giving us is that, think about sin as this crouching warrior at the door of your heart. Are you going to let it in? Because if you open that door of your heart, it is going to pounce upon you. Saying, Cain, if you continue to nurture that anger within you, if you continue to open that door, sin is going to rush into that heart of yours. It is crouching. It is ready. It is ready to pounce and take over your heart. So God warns Cain and says to Cain, look, you have to subdue it. You have to master it. And how often do we have these desires that come into our hearts and these desires that come into our lives? And what God is saying is, you need to wrestle with those desires, Cain. And you need to wrestle with them, and you need to fight them, and you need to go to battle with them, and you need to master them and subdue them. You need to take that crouching tiger that's about ready to pounce upon your heart, and you need to fight that tiger. You need to master that tiger. You need to be the lion, tiger tamer when it comes to these desires and these sins in your life. So that's what you need to do, Cain. So offer some advice, offer some wisdom, says here's what you can do about it, like any good parent. But Cain just ignores it all. Cain calls Abel out into the field and says, come out into the field where nobody can see, where there are no witnesses, where there's no media coverage, where there's no social media, where there's no person to help you if you cry out. This is premeditated murder. He premeditates this. This is Cain premeditating the whole response, the whole sin. So not only is he angry, but he sins in his anger. And so this is what happens. And, I think about his anger and how his anger contributed to this. And I think about, some anger is pretty good. Some anger can be good. Anger that makes us right wrongs of the world can be a good type of anger, or gets us to speak truth about something can be a good kind of anger. And then there's anger that's not so good, that's actually harmful and hurts others. And so anger can go two ways. It's really about how we respond with that anger. What will we do with that anger? How do we wrestle and master the anger within ourselves? And there are two ways I see that we don't master it. One I would call toxic anger. That's the anger where you take anger, you're angry about something, but you stuff it inside. You press it down. You shove it in. And what happens with that anger, and the reason it's still harmful, is because it's more like a toxic leak. And it leaks out of us in other ways. We don't like go outward with it. We kind of go inward with it, and then it kind of leaks out into our relationships in bitterness and resentment. And we start to be passive, we do passive aggressive things. We start to drag our feet in relationship to other people. Oh, well, I'll get to that when I can, because, and that's really passive aggressiveness. It's like, I'm not really going to go help you. I'm going to take as long as I possibly can to help you, even though I said I was going to help you, because that's passive aggressive. I'm letting the anger leak out. It's a toxic leak. Or I'm going to distance myself from my relationship with you. I'm going to withdraw from you. I'm not going to speak to you very much, or I'm going to isolate myself from you, or I'm going to give you the silent treatment. I'm just not going to talk to you. I'm going to cut you off. That can be a toxic leak in our relationships. And that's the anger, we're really good at that kind of anger, aren't we? We're good at stuffing stuff. Because we hear this stuff about mastering anger. We hear this stuff about not being angry in the Bible, and we think, all right, that I'll just stuff it. I'll just tamp it down, but eventually it comes out. It leaks out and becomes toxic to our relationships. That's dysfunction. So we've been talking about in this series, the family dysfunctions, and we can actually probably think of examples of that in our own families where we've done that. But then there's the other family members, and some of us are one, sometimes we're one or the other, or we're both, but the other one is that there's that explosive anger, We have those family members that they just, when they get angry, you know it. They are letting the whole world know. It just explodes. They're calling people names and throwing people under the bus left and right, and they are yelling, they're screaming, they're upset. They're even throwing things across the room sometimes, punching holes in walls. Unfortunately, sometimes hitting people and abusing people and doing harm that way. And that's explosive. That's dangerous because it starts to hurt everybody around them. And everybody around them watches the explosion. They start to get hurt by the explosion. These little pieces of shrapnel start to hit them in the explosion, and so they begin to back away from that relationship. And that's just as damaging. That's damaging. It breaks relationship. That's part of the dysfunction. Cain, I think, had both going on. I think Cain was trying to, maybe he tried to hear God's advice. Maybe he heard God's advice and he was trying to, so he stuffed the anger. And it turned into bitterness and resentment. And that toxic leak just oozed out of him. And eventually, he just took Abel out into the field. And maybe Abel said something. Maybe he said something. He just blew up. He just lost it. He killed his brother. He murdered his brother. Because he didn't master his anger. He could have stuffed it or he could have exploded it. But the bottom line is he didn't master it. He didn't subdue it. It was still working in him. Jesus actually said in the New Testament, he said this. He says, "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times," referring to the Old Testament, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' which means like, 'You idiot, you stupid idiot,' you will be liable to the hell of fire." It's pretty strong. But what Jesus is, in a sense, what Jesus is teaching is like, don't let anger even in the door of your heart. Protect it. Fight against it coming in. Do whatever you need to do to not allow anger to actually take root in you, to get inside of your heart. So that's not pressing it down or subduing or stuffing it, and that's not exploding it. It's trying to keep it from coming in. To kind of gain perspective. I find that sometimes when I get angry about things, that sometimes I need to take a step back. I need to take a deep breath. I need to take a moment and I need to say to myself, what's really going on here? How can I get perspective on this situation? How can I understand the other perspective, put myself in the other person's shoes? Because as I do that, anger starts to lose its grip on me. And that's one way that I can begin to master it rather than be mastered by it. That's one way I can help to rise above that desire, to rise above that so that I don't allow the anger to lead me to do something that would harm somebody else, whether by toxic leak or by explosion. Because the anger is not really the problem, it's what we do with the anger that's the problem. And how we respond to it, and how do we handle that desire within us. We need to master it. Now, God's response to Cain after his brother's murder is very interesting, the same response that he gave to Adam and Eve when they sinned in the garden. So God comes to Cain and says, seeks him out. First he seeks out, he calls out, and he sends out again, just like the Garden of Eden. First thing he says is Cain, where is your brother? In the garden it was, where are you? Adam and Eve. Here it's, where's your brother, Cain? And Cain, and to me, this is God's opportunity. God's giving Cain an opportunity, another opportunity to come clean. Another opportunity to be vulnerable, to confess, to say I did something wrong, to offer up that, yes, I sinned. But what does he do? So Adam and Eve covered up their sin with bushes and blaming each other and blaming others, right? That's shame and blame, what we talked about. Cain covers up his with a lie. This is the first time that a lie is used to cover up sin in the Bible. So what Cain does is he lies about it. He says, I don't know. Who ate all the ice cream? I don't know. Who didn't take the trash out? I don't know. Who took money off of my dresser? I don't know. It's the first lie. Lies to cover up sin. And so he doesn't take the opportunity. So God says, okay, and God knows exactly where Abel is. God knows it because God says, I can hear your brother's blood crying out to me from the ground. God knows exactly what's happened. So then he calls him out. He says, here's some accountability. Cain, what have you done? I know you did something. What have you done to cause your brother's blood to fall on the ground? Accountability has come to Cain. It's interesting that Cain's response is, am I my brother's keeper? Now, let me just reinterpret that for you a little bit. He's basically saying, am I the shepherd of the shepherd? His brother was a shepherd. He says, am I the keeper of the shepherd? Am I the shepherd of the shepherd? And if you've been a parent, you've heard this before. This is attitude. This is disrespect. This is sass. He is sassing God. He's saying, am I my brother? He's kind of like in your face. You're the one who made him a shepherd. You're the one that favored his offering. Am I to be concerned with him? There's still that bitterness and resentment residing in that response that says Cain has fully given in. Fully given in. Fully allowed sin to take him over. Fully allowed this anger and this evil to take root into his heart. So God says, okay, still don't get it, do you? Out you go. Away from the land that would provide food for you, away from your family, and away from me. Because obviously, you don't get it. You don't understand. You're not willing to come to terms with your sin. And so, he is banished. I want to note here, though, that again, God's grace. There's no eye for an eye here. There's no tooth for a tooth here. There's no getting even. There's no taking his life for Abel's life. It's banishment. It is punishment. There are consequences, but it's not eye for an eye. And so much of our anger, though, isn't our anger about an eye for an eye? About getting even? About getting back? About getting retribution? About getting what we think that other person deserves? Did Abel deserve to die? Cain certainly thought so. But maybe his anger was clouding his judgment. Now, it's also interesting. I just want to point out one other thing about Cain's response. The last thing Cain does in this text is what we all do when we're punished. He complains. That's too much for me to bear. This is too great a punishment for me. How many of us, when our parents gave us some consequences, were complained about the consequences that we got, right? It's not fair, right? Because we, again, can't see the truth about ourselves. You know, in the midst of this whole text and in the midst of the New Testament, I see two good pieces of good news here that I think is very applicable for us this week. You know, I think about this week and I think about all the things that have happened in the media, lives that were taken by police lives that were taken this week. And I look at that, and then you look at what happened at Pulse, and we look at what happened in Ferguson, and we look at what happened in Sandy Hook, and we look at these things going on that our media portrays to us and presents to us. And the good news here in this text for me is that even though I don't see justice in this world sometimes, that God hears the cries. God says, I hear the cry of your brother's blood coming from the ground. And I believe that every drop of blood that has been spilt cries out to God for justice. I know that God sees it, I know that God hears it, and I know that God cries with us. That's kind of where I see God hearing our cries. And so just as the blood of Abel cried out from the ground, there's another drop of blood that cries out from the cross. The blood of Jesus Christ on the cross cries out for mercy, for grace, for forgiveness. And that we know that even in our sin, that we can go to the cross and Jesus' blood covers us. and cries out mercy for us, cries out to God for forgiveness for us, cries out grace for us. And God hears that too. Isn't that good news? Because we've all failed to master sin. And we all need the blood of Jesus Christ. The question is, have you also noticed this about forgiveness and grace, is that even though I know that I'm forgiven, even though that God forgives me for every single sin in my life, even though that I know about God's grace, have you noticed that the struggle with sin's still there? Have you noticed that the ability to master it is still a struggle, even after grace, even after forgiveness, that you still struggle with it even though you know you're forgiven? And I see two responses to that sometimes in life. One is, God, thank you for your grace. I'm not going to change a thing about my life. I'm not even going to try and master sin. I'm just going to accept your grace and not do anything different. And then there's another response, and that response I feel is one of, God, thank you for your grace. Now I want to live my life in response to that grace. I want to live my life wholly pleasing to you in response to your grace. I want to offer my life as a living sacrifice, giving my best to you, God. That's a different response, isn't it, to grace? You know, I think about, I don't know if anybody been watching Shark Week? Anybody watch Shark Week? No Shark Week watchers here? I like turn on there, and one of the things that they talk about are these stories of survivors. You know, there was a guy named Krishna who was out on his 10-year anniversary, went to the Bahamas. One morning went out for a swim, left his wife in the room, went out for a swim, was attacked by a shark, lost his left leg. And then when they interviewed him, they said, you know, so how do you feel about sharks now? He's like, oh, you know, I want to educate people about them. I wanted to learn more about them. And what was he doing with his second chances at life? He was trying to help other people and trying to help others and trying to help protect sharks. I think about that. That was a grateful response to his second chance. And when we receive the grace and forgiveness of God, it's like God's given us a second chance. And are we grateful for that second chance? And what do we do with that second chance? How do we live our life with that second chance? In gratitude and to live as the people God calls us to be. Amen?